The frozen silence of Bastogne held a secret that night. Beneath the black Belgian sky, 19-year-old Private James Edward Mitchell gripped the icy handles of his quad .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, fighting sleep and cold in equal measure. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the sub-zero temperatures biting through every layer of wool and cotton he wore. The date was January 17th, 1945, and Mitchell had been trained for exactly 6 days on this weapon system before being thrown into the siege. He was supposed to watch the sky for German aircraft, follow protocol, obey the manual, and never, under any circumstances, point those 4 heavy barrels toward the ground. But at exactly 0320 hours, Mitchell heard something that changed everything. Not the drone of engines overhead, not the whistle of artillery, but a sound that didn't belong. A metallic click from the tree line, followed by the soft crunch of boots on frozen snow. Multiple sets of boots, moving with careful coordination, closing the distance to American positions, while every sentry and listening post remained oblivious. The shapes materialized from the darkness, low and fast, not stragglers or scouts, but the lead element of an entire SS infiltration force designed to collapse 2 American battalions before dawn. Mitchell had seconds to decide, follow the rules, and watch them slip inside the perimeter, or violate every order he'd been given, and do the one thing the training manual explicitly forbade. He made his choice in the space between heartbeats. Mitchell lowered all 4 Browning machine guns toward the earth and pressed the firing pedal. What happened next tore through the night like a thunderclap and rewrote American battlefield doctrine for the next 50 years. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this, the ones that changed history in ways no one expected, deserve to be remembered. The kid from Nebraska, James Edward Mitchell, didn't grow up wanting to be a soldier. He grew up in the wetlands outside Lincoln, Nebraska, where silence wasn't really silence at all. It was information. His father taught him to hunt ducks in the cold pre-dawn hours, teaching him a lesson that would one day save thousands of lives. Listen first, move second. Out in those marshes, every sound mattered. A wrong noise meant something alive was moving. A shift in the wind meant your aim would be off. And if you didn't pay attention to the small details, you went home empty-handed. Mitchell absorbed this skill without realizing he was building what the Army would later call situational awareness, the ability to detect threats before they fully materialized. He was the youngest of 4 brothers and the 4th to leave home for the war. On the day he turned 19, Mitchell signed the enlistment papers. It wasn't heroism that drove him, it was necessity. The farm was failing, jobs were scarce, and the war needed bodies faster than the training camps could prepare them. His father said almost nothing when Mitchell left. His mother pressed a pair of wool gloves into his hands, knitted with her own trembling fingers. That was their entire goodbye. No speeches, no promises, just the quiet understanding that whatever happened next, he had chosen it. Fort Bliss didn't care who Mitchell was or where he came from. It barely cared if recruits could spell the word anti-aircraft. The only thing that mattered was whether they could learn fast enough to replace the constant stream of casualties pouring back from Europe. Before D-Day, anti-aircraft training took 17 weeks. By late 1944, the Army had cut it to 8. There was no time to soften the blow, no time to build confidence slowly. The program worked like a conveyor belt. Learn the weapon, learn aircraft recognition, learn tracking drills, then get shipped out before the knowledge had time to settle. Technical Sergeant Robert Hansen, the lead instructor, introduced himself to the class with a warning delivered without sugarcoating. Once the Luftwaffe starts targeting your position, your life expectancy is 45 minutes, he said flatly. Not an hour, not half a day. 45 minutes. He let the message hit before continuing. Your job is to fire until your barrels melt or you're neutralized. That's it. Men swallowed hard. Mitchell didn't forget those words. By week 6, Mitchell's name appeared on the short list of recommended for veteran crew assignment. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just kept moving because the war was moving faster than everyone training for it. Instructors noticed something about him. When targets moved, he reacted faster than most recruits. His hands didn't fight the controls. He didn't overthink. He followed motion like he'd been doing since he was 12 years old in a duck blind. Across the Atlantic, Mitchell graduated on November 12, 1944. 2 days later, he received orders to Camp Kilmer for immediate deployment. The timing told him everything he needed to know. Someone out there needed replacements now. He got 48 hours at home before shipping out. He spent most of it trying not to think about leaving again. He slept in his childhood bed and listened to the wind outside the window, the same wind that used to warn him when ducks were lifting off the water. His father shook his hand at the door. Mitchell waited for some kind of advice, something to hold on to. All he got was 2 words: come home. On November 18th, Mitchell boarded the troopship USS Monticello. The North Atlantic in winter didn't care about comfort. The ship rolled in every direction. Metal groaned, and rumors of U-boats crawled through the lower decks like cold air. Mitchell spent most of the 9-day crossing seasick, staring at the underside of the bunk above him, wondering how a man who couldn't stand upright on a boat was supposed to track a fast-moving aircraft. He arrived in Southampton on November 27th and was processed at Tidworth Barracks. He spent 2 uneasy weeks in drills and waiting, the part of war no one talked about. Then the German offensive hit. The Ardennes exploded. The 101st Airborne was cut off at Bastogne. Anti-aircraft units were being consumed as fast as they could be replaced. On December 14th, Mitchell received his orders: 796th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, Battery B, support the 1st Airborne at Bastogne, immediate movement. He crossed the Channel on December 16th, the exact day the Battle of the Bulge began. He was trucked toward the front through a landscape of abandoned vehicles, burning wrecks, and exhausted soldiers falling back from the German advance. On December 19th, he reached the outskirts of Bastogne just as the trap closed around it. Inside the siege, Mitchell wasn't a trainee anymore. He wasn't practicing on silhouettes. He wasn't tracking wooden targets on rails. He was part of Battery B, 4 quad 50 positions around a surrounded town, freezing, tired, and holding on because there was no place left to go. He was assigned as the assistant gunner on Gun 3. When Mitchell arrived on the outskirts of Bastogne, the war no longer looked like training slides or instruction manuals. It looked like chaos. The roads leading toward the town were jammed with retreating units, trucks stuck in ditches, overturned jeeps, and abandoned equipment half buried in snow. Soldiers with hollow eyes trudged past the incoming replacements without saying a word. No one needed to explain what that meant. Bastogne itself was already surrounded. The German encirclement had closed hours before Mitchell got there. Newly arrived replacements were immediately thrown into positions with no time to acclimate, no time to adjust, and no time to even understand the full situation. You simply stepped off the truck and joined the fight wherever someone pointed. Mitchell's gun crew consisted of 3 men who had been together since North Africa. Sergeant First Class William Barnes, 32 years old, the gun commander. Professional, steady, but visibly exhausted. Corporal David Walsh, 23, the primary gunner. Private First Class Raymond Torres, 21, the loader. Barnes looked Mitchell up and down the moment he checked in. "You're the second assistant gunner I've had this week," he said flatly. "The first one was taken out by artillery 2 days ago. Do your job, stay alert, and maybe we both make it out." That was the welcome. During the first week inside the Bastogne perimeter, Mitchell got a crash course in what siege conditions actually meant. Constant artillery, cold so sharp it made metal painful to touch, rations that seemed smaller every day, no proper sleep, no guarantee the line would hold after dark. Even the veterans looked worn thin. Battery B's Quad 50s were firing constantly, not at infantry, but at German aircraft, trying to strafe American positions or attack the vital supply drops. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared enough for a massive Allied resupply operation. Dozens of C-47s flew straight into the pocket, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food. German fighters swarmed the drop zone, and Battery B opened up with everything they had. Mitchell worked as Walsh's feeder, slamming belt after belt of ammunition into place, while the entire gun vibrated under the 4 heavy barrels. Tracers shot upward, stitching the air. One enemy Me-109 caught a burst, trailed smoke, and spiraled down in the distance. Mitchell shouted over the noise, "Did we hit him?" Barnes, watching through binoculars, just nodded. "That's a kill. Keep feeding." Mitchell did, but the excitement of hitting an aircraft evaporated quickly. When the fighter crashed outside the perimeter, the reality hit him. He had helped take down a man he would never meet, someone who never saw him. That contradiction sat with him for days. The moment everything changed. By early January 1945, Patton's Third Army finally broke through to relieve Bastogne. The siege was technically lifted, but the fighting didn't stop. German units continued launching counterattacks, and every man in the 101st Airborne and supporting units was running on fumes. Then on January 15th, everything changed for Mitchell. Corporal Walsh, the primary gunner, collapsed from severe frostbite, both feet. He was evacuated immediately. That left the quad mount without a primary gunner. Barnes didn't hesitate. He turned to Mitchell and Torres. "Mitchell, you're primary now," he said. "Torres, your assistant. We'll get a replacement loader when we get one." It was a simple announcement, but its weight was enormous. The 19-year-old with 6 days of Quad 50 experience was now responsible for the weapon that could mean life or elimination for dozens of men in their sector. Mitchell spent the next day relearning the gun from the primary position. The system looked simple. 2 hand grips to traverse and elevate, 1 foot pedal to fire all 4 barrels. But using it in real conditions was a different world. No radar, no computer guidance, just human judgment, instinct, and reaction time. The replacement loader arrived the next day. Private Eugene Patterson, 18 years old, 3 weeks out of training, 5 days in Europe, even greener than Mitchell. Barnes gathered them that evening. "We're scraping the bottom of the barrel," he said. "You're young, you're green, but this gun is the difference between our guys living and being taken out. Follow orders, stay awake, don't panic." No one argued. They were too tired to waste energy pretending they were ready. That night, Mitchell got his assignment, the 0200 to 0400 guard shift. The deadest part of the night, the coldest hours, the hours when even veterans struggled to stay awake, the hours when things went wrong, the longest shift. Mitchell tried to sleep before his shift, but sleep in a frozen dugout outside Bastogne was more of an agreement between your body and the cold. He lay there wrapped in a blanket stiff from frost, boots still on, coat still buttoned, shaking even before he stepped back into the night. At 1:45, Torres nudged him awake. "Your turn, quiet night. Stay awake. Barnes will have your head if you don't." Mitchell climbed out into a darkness so complete it felt physical, not just the absence of light, but a wall of black pressing against his eyes. The air was so cold it bit the inside of his nose. His breath turned to crystals instantly. He could see maybe 20 yards. After that, everything blurred into one featureless mass of black and white. He slid into the gunner's seat on the Quad 50 and gripped the chilled metal handles. The seat felt like a slab of ice. The wind cut through every layer he had. He forced himself upright, blinking hard, doing anything to keep from falling back into sleep. This was the shift no one wanted. The hours when nothing happened until something did. The hours when tired men misheard things. The hours when attacks slipped through. But Mitchell did what doctrine demanded. Watch the sky, listen for aircraft, wait for Barnes to give the order, never fire at ground targets, Never act without authorization. He repeated the rules in his head because repetition kept him awake. His body ached to sleep, his vision blurred at the edges, and the cold numbed his fingers even through his gloves. But he stayed focused on the sky because that was his job. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Nothing. Just the wind moving through dead branches. At 3:15, something changed. A sound, faint, metallic, completely wrong. Mitchell froze. It was small but unmistakable. Not artillery, not armor, not aircraft. A metal clip tapping against another piece of equipment, a buckle shifting, a boot scraping ice just a little too carefully. He held his breath and listened again. Nothing. Maybe he imagined it. Exhaustion plays tricks. Everyone knew that. He shook his head hard, rubbed his eyes, looked back up at the sky. Empty. Then the sound came again, clearer this time, from the tree line. A soft crunch, then another, not random, not animal. Multiple sources, his chest tightened. Instinct, the same one he learned in the marshes, was screaming the truth. Something alive is moving, something coordinated, something coming straight for us. But training slammed into that instinct. Don't panic. Don't wake the crew unless you're certain. Don't fire without permission. Don't point the gun at the ground. Ever. Mitchell hesitated, gripping the handle so tightly the metal dug into his gloves. He wanted to call Barnes. He should call Barnes, but if he was wrong, Barnes had said it himself. Wake me for nothing, and you'll regret it. Mitchell stared into the darkness, begging his eyes to make sense of shapes that weren't there. Then, at 3:20, he saw it. Movement, not imagined, not vague. Actual shapes crossing through gaps in the tree line. Low, deliberate. Many, too many to be a patrol. Too organized to be scattered refugees, and they were closing the distance fast. He felt a surge of fear, sharp, controlled, and unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. Standard procedure was clear. Wake Barnes, confirm visual, request permission for flares, wait for orders. But the shapes were already moving across open snow. In seconds, they would be inside the American perimeter, inside the lines, inside the tents, inside the sleeping positions. There would be no time for flares, no time to assemble a defense, no time for anything. Mitchell had a choice. Follow the book or follow the instinct honed from a lifetime of listening for the wrong sound at the wrong time. His pulse hammered in his ears. He made the decision without fully realizing he'd made it. He lowered the quad 50 all the way down. The metal joints groaned softly as the barrels dipped to a position they were never meant to take. The glowing ring sight settled onto the dark shifting shapes moving across the frozen ground. He didn't call out. He didn't ask permission. He didn't think. He pressed his boot against the firing pedal. 15 seconds. 4. Browning M2 machine guns roared to life at once. The sound exploded through the night like a thunderclap. The recoil rocked the entire mount back. Tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, slashed across the snow in crimson streaks. The silent approach of the enemy evaporated in an instant. Mitchell didn't know who they were. He didn't know how many. He didn't know that the men in his sights belonged to the 2nd SS Panzer Division's night infiltration force, the spearhead of a much larger assault waiting behind them. All he knew was that he had broken every rule he'd been taught, and he did it because something deep inside him told him there was no time for anything else. The moment Mitchell pressed the firing pedal, the night split open. 4 Browning M250 caliber machine guns erupted at once, drowning the forest edge in a deafening roar. The entire quad mount shook violently. Brass casings sprayed across the frozen ground. The barrels glowed faint red almost immediately. A stream of tracers, perfectly spaced, 1 every 5th round, ripped across the snow at 2,800 feet per second, carving 4 parallel lines of burning red into the darkness. The effect was instant. The shapes he'd seen, the ones moving low and fast across the open ground, weren't shadows. They were German infantry, not a patrol, not stragglers. They were the reconnaissance element of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the men tasked with opening a gap in the American lines for a full-scale night assault. And they were caught in the open. The first burst hit the front ranks like a physical wall. The 50 caliber rounds designed to tear through aircraft plating hit human bodies with catastrophic force. Limbs disintegrated. Men were thrown backward as if struck by a truck. Others collapsed instantly, torn apart before they realized a gun had even fired. The snow sprayed upward in white fountains where bullets struck the ground, except where they struck flesh. There it turned red. Mitchell didn't stop. He held the pedal down. The quad mount screamed, spitting out 2,000 rounds per minute. Behind him, Torres and Patterson exploded out of the dugout, confused, half asleep, shouting questions he couldn't hear. Barnes stumbled out next, boots half-laced, grabbing binoculars, ready to tear into Mitchell for firing without a command. But the tracers showed the truth. Barnes froze. Because the field in front of them, just seconds earlier, a blank sheet of snow, was now alive with chaos. Men dropping, men crawling, men turning to run. A formation collapsing under fire it had never planned for and couldn't possibly survive. Mitchell kept firing. He didn't know how many. He didn't know who was left. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing anymore. All he felt was recoil vibrating through metal and bone, the freezing wind tearing across his face, and the sickening understanding that he had crossed a line he could not uncross. After roughly 15 seconds, his mind finally caught up with his actions. He lifted his foot off the pedal. The sudden silence was almost worse than the gunfire. Mitchell stared into the darkness, chest heaving, unable to process what he had done. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Oh God, what did I do?" Barnes didn't answer. He was too busy staring through binoculars, scanning the field illuminated by the fading tracers. What he saw shut him up instantly. Dozens of German soldiers lay sprawled across the open ground. Many were motionless. Some were crawling, leaving dark trails behind them in the snow. The survivors, what few remained, were retreating as fast as they could toward the tree line. After 3 seconds of stunned silence, Barnes lowered the binoculars. His face, moments earlier, contorted in anger, shifted into something else entirely. Shock, awe, and something bordering on disbelief. He whispered, "Holy Mother of God." Then louder to the entire crew, "Torres, radio battalion now. We've got enemy infantry, battalion strength, attempting infiltration. Mitchell just stopped a night assault." The truth revealed. The urgency snapped everyone into motion. Torres grabbed the radio, shouting coordinates and descriptions into the handset. Patterson scrambled to prepare the gun for another burst if needed. Mitchell just sat there shaking, staring at the smoking barrels. Within minutes, flares were launched across the sector. They hissed upward, then burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in harsh white light. What they revealed shocked even veteran soldiers who had seen months of combat. At least 80 German soldiers lay neutralized or wounded, the leading edge of the assault force. The rest had fled back to the forest, their carefully planned infiltration obliterated by one burst of unauthorized fire. But that wasn't the full scale of it. Because those men Mitchell engaged weren't acting alone. Inside the tree line were over 1,500 additional German troops, supported by armor, waiting for one signal that the infiltrators had successfully breached the American perimeter. When that signal didn't come, when the field instead lit up with American flares and panicked German survivors fleeing back into the forest, the German commanders realized the truth. The element of surprise was gone. The attack was compromised. The full-night assault had to be called off. 2 battalions of American infantry, the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, and parts of the 327th Glider Infantry had been seconds away from annihilation without even knowing an attack was coming. Mitchell hadn't saved a gun crew. He hadn't saved a squad. He had saved an entire sector, and he had done it by breaking every rule of anti-aircraft warfare. As the flares burned out and the night slowly reclaimed the field, Barnes walked over and put a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. Not angry, not scolding, just quiet. "You just saved all our lives," he said. "Don't know how you did it, but you did." Mitchell didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were still shaking. The barrels were still smoking. The snow was still settling around the bodies of men he had never meant to target. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt sick. Because for the first time since arriving in Belgium, Mitchell understood the reality most soldiers learn only after their first close call. It's possible to do everything wrong and still be the reason people survive. And in Bastogne that night, that was exactly what had happened. The enemy's confession. The moment the last flare burned out, reality hit the sector like a shock wave. Within minutes, radios across the American line erupted with overlapping voices, reports of movement, requests for confirmation, shouted questions no one yet had answers to. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What happened near Gun 3? Battalion headquarters demanded an immediate situation report. Companies along the perimeter reported seeing tracers ripping across the snow. Forward observers swore they hadn't spotted anything. Listening posts insisted they heard nothing unusual. But the one undeniable fact was this. A German infiltration force had been shredded before it even reached the American lines, and nobody understood how a 19-year-old gunner, alone in the dark, had noticed what every trained sentry had missed. When the officers arrived at the gun position, they found Mitchell sitting on an ammunition crate, hands still trembling uncontrollably. The barrels of the Quad 50 were steaming in the cold air. Scattered brass covered the snow like a second layer of ice. Mitchell looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Barnes did the talking, short, direct, factual. He heard movement, he saw shapes, he engaged, he stopped a night assault. But headquarters wanted more than just a summary. They wanted an explanation, something clean, something official. Because nothing about this incident fit doctrine. When Battalion Commander Colonel Marcus Hayes arrived, Mitchell forced himself to stand. Hayes stared at him for several long seconds before speaking. "Private, you violated every rule of anti-aircraft employment." His tone was sharp, not emotional, the tone of a man sorting out disaster from triumph. "You fired a strategic air defense weapon at ground targets without authorization. You wasted ammunition. You compromised our anti-aircraft posture. Do you understand that?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Hayes continued. "You should have woken your sergeant. You should have requested flares. You should have followed procedure." Another pause, then quietly, a shift in tone. "You also detected an infiltration no one else saw. You reacted faster than trained sentries. You disrupted a major German assault. You saved at least 2,000 American lives." He let that hang. "Then here's what's going to happen, officially. This never happened. We don't need questions about why an anti-aircraft gun was firing horizontally. Unofficially, you did something remarkable. Understood." Mitchell nodded. He didn't feel relieved. He didn't feel proud. He felt sick. But the story didn't stay buried. Stories never stay buried in war. By dawn the next morning, every AA crew in the 101st Airborne had heard about the kid who fired at the ground and wiped out a German infiltration team. By that evening, the story reached division headquarters. Within 48 hours, soldiers arriving with replacement convoys were already repeating a distorted version, part rumor, part awe, part confusion. But the clearest account didn't come from the Americans at all. It came from the enemy. 3 weeks later, American intelligence interrogated SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Hoffmann, the officer commanding the reconnaissance battalion that Mitchell had shredded. Hoffmann survived the attack, barely. During questioning, he laid out the German plan and what went wrong. His men had infiltrated carefully for 5 days. They mapped sentry posts, noted weak points, identified listening posts that looked undermanned, confirmed that American forces were exhausted, shivering, and barely maintaining night security. Their plan was simple: slip inside the American perimeter, create chaos in the rear, signal the main assault force, over 1,500 troops and armor, to advance, collapse the American sector before dawn. And then came the line that stunned American intelligence. "Your sentries were asleep or inattentive," Hoffman said. "We were inside your perimeter, preparing to signal the main assault. Then suddenly, one of your anti-aircraft weapons engaged us at ground level." The fire was devastating. Hoffman estimated they lost over 80 men in the first burst alone. When interrogators asked why the infiltration failed so catastrophically, Hoffman said something that unknowingly captured the entire essence of the event. "We had accounted for everything, except that someone would be watching the ground with a gun built to shoot at the sky." His answer revealed the uncomfortable truth. Mitchell didn't just fire early. He didn't just break doctrine. He attacked from an angle the Germans hadn't considered possible. Their entire plan hinged on one assumption: that American anti-aircraft crews would be staring upward, waiting for planes, not scanning the tree line. Mitchell shattered that assumption in 15 seconds. And the German night assault, planned with precision, rehearsed for days, and reinforced with heavy support, collapsed before it began. Rewriting the manual. By the morning after the failed infiltration, the immediate danger had passed. But something else had begun. Officers, crews, and entire battalions around Bastogne were suddenly talking about one thing: the anti-aircraft gun that fired at the ground. At first, it sounded like a fluke, a rumor, a story exaggerated in the retelling. But when battalion staff reviewed the reports, when officers walked the field illuminated by flare residue, when intelligence confirmed the German plan, the tone changed. Mitchell hadn't just interrupted an attack, he had forced a rethink. A simple, dangerous question emerged. In every briefing room around the perimeter, someone eventually asked the same question: why wasn't any anti-aircraft unit watching the ground? The manuals were clear. AA guns defend against aircraft, sentries defend against infantry, listening posts detect movement, AA crews focus upward. But the manuals didn't matter in Bastogne. Reality did. A 19-year-old had detected what 3 layers of standard defenses had missed. His action, unauthorized, technically incorrect, completely outside doctrine, had succeeded where trained procedures had failed. No officer liked admitting that, but no one could ignore it either. Informal changes spread first. Before any official policy shifted, the practical adjustments began. Battery B was the first, but not the last. Other AA crews started doing what Mitchell did by instinct, scanning tree lines between sweeps of the sky, listening for ground movement, positioning their mounts with just enough downward angle to cover key approaches, assigning one crewman to watch the ground while the gunner watched the air. None of it was written in orders. None of it had formal approval. Every bit of it violated pre-war doctrine. But it worked, and word traveled fast. AA crews across the 101st and supporting units began quietly adopting the habit. Some officers resisted, calling it reckless or misuse of equipment. Others, especially those who had seen the infiltration site, said only, "Do whatever keeps us alive." By late January 1945, the story reached 3rd Army headquarters. By early February, it was circulating inside anti-aircraft training commands back in the States. Initial reports were heavily sanitized. No mention of disobeyed orders, no mention of firing without authorization, but the core point was impossible to ignore. Anti-aircraft weapons had devastating unforeseen potential against ground targets. Training officers asked for details. Doctrine officers asked for data. Someone finally put it into writing: evaluate dual-purpose defensive use of AA platforms in emergency situations. That sentence opened a door that had been closed since the beginning of the war. In March 1945, the Army issued Field Circular 1245. It didn't mention Mitchell. It didn't mention Bastogne. but anyone who knew the story understood exactly where it came from. The circular formally recognized that anti-aircraft weapons could be employed against ground forces under certain conditions, especially during night infiltration risk. What had been forbidden for years was now officially an option. From that point on, AA crews were no longer told to stare only at the sky. They were told to watch everything. The impact didn't stop with the final months of World War II. In Korea, Quad 50 mounts were routinely used to defend fire bases and road convoys. Soldiers called them buzz saws. In Vietnam, the successor system, the M45 quad mount, was redesigned with lower elevation limits and improved sights specifically for ground engagement. AA guns became primary defensive weapons for landing zones, not aircraft destroyers. The principle was simple. A weapon built for one purpose might be far deadlier when used for another. And that principle began with a 19-year-old in Bastogne who acted without permission because instinct shouted louder than doctrine. After the war, when orders reached Battery B on February 23, 1945, Mitchell didn't know whether to feel relieved or guilty. He was being pulled off the line, not for punishment, but for something that felt almost stranger. The Army wanted him as an instructor. Someone in the chain of command had decided that his experience in Bastogne, the unauthorized firing, the instinctive reaction, the near disaster that became a miracle, made him valuable for training new anti-aircraft crews. They needed someone who had seen what manuals couldn't teach. So after barely 2 months of actual combat, Mitchell packed his gear, shook hands with his exhausted crew, and left Belgium behind. Barnes pulled him aside the night before he boarded the truck out. "You know what you did, right?" Mitchell didn't answer. "You saved lives," Barnes continued. "Maybe mine, definitely a lot of others. Don't convince yourself it was luck." Mitchell shook his head. "I did everything wrong, Sergeant." Barnes corrected him immediately. "No, you did everything different. There's a difference." Mitchell remembered that sentence for the rest of his life. Back at Fort Bliss, Mitchell was assigned to teach the same 8-week program he had completed months earlier. Mechanical drills, aircraft identification, fire control, combined operations. But he didn't teach it the same way. He talked more about instinct, about listening to the environment, about not trusting perfect conditions, about watching the ground, not just the sky, about staying alert when your brain and body begged for sleep. Some instructors didn't like the way he taught, too unstructured, too focused on judgment over procedure. But no one could argue with the fact that he had survived one of the hardest testing grounds possible, and every class he taught heard a version of the same message. A gun can't save you. A manual can't save you. Your awareness does. It wasn't bravado, it was the truth, as he understood it. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Mitchell didn't celebrate. He didn't feel triumph. He felt tired in a way he struggled to explain. He was discharged later that year with the rank of sergeant and a Bronze Star, a citation carefully worded to hide every uncomfortable detail of what had really happened in Bastogne. It read like a clean, tidy version of the truth. Mitchell went home to Nebraska, used the GI Bill, and enrolled at the University of Nebraska. He chose forestry, drawn back to the outdoors, not because it erased anything, but because it gave him room to breathe. He graduated in 1949, married a local girl named Dorothy Hanson, and took a job with the Nebraska National Forest Service. He raised children who knew he had served at Bastogne, but never heard the full story. He didn't hide it. He simply couldn't explain it, not in a way that made sense outside the frozen darkness of that night in 1945. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, it was brief, factual, and usually ended with, "It was complicated." Because it was. In 1994, after decades of avoiding reunions, he attended a gathering of the 796th Anti-Aircraft Battalion in Washington. His wife convinced him to go, saying he owed himself the chance to reconnect. There, over dinner, he met a military historian researching anti-aircraft operations during the Battle of the Bulge. The historian had heard fragments of a story about an AA gunner who fired at the ground and saved 2 battalions. Mitchell listened quietly as the historian explained what he'd pieced together from after-action reports and interrogation records. The noise in the tree line, the shapes in the dark, the decision he wasn't supposed to make, the burst that stopped an assault no one else knew was coming. When he finished, the historian sat back and said, "Do you realize what you actually did? You didn't just stop one attack. You changed how the Army thinks about defensive weapons. Every quad mount used in Korea, every redesigned AA system in Vietnam, every crew taught to watch the ground as well as the sky, all of that traces back to you. You weren't just fighting that night, you were rewriting doctrine, even if you didn't know it." Mitchell sat there for a long time before responding. "I was scared," he said quietly. "I heard something wrong, and I reacted. That's all." The historian shook his head. "No, that's everything. Because most people freeze, most people wait for orders, most people follow the manual, even when the manual is wrong. You didn't. And that's why 2,000 men walked away from Bastogne instead of being overrun in their sleep." James Edward Mitchell passed away in 2006 at the age of 80. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought recognition. He never claimed he invented anything or changed the Army, but the Army changed anyway. Because one night, one burst of fire, and one terrified decision forced an entire branch of the military to confront a blind spot it never saw coming. The manuals moved, the rules shifted, doctrine adapted, all because someone did the wrong thing, and it turned out to be exactly right. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the untold moments that shaped history. And leave a comment telling us what lesson you take from Mitchell's story. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your instincts when everyone else is looking the other way.